Thank you for joining us to learn about Massachusetts' Next Generation Accountability System. The purpose of this presentation is to provide an introduction to the new district and school accountability system that the Massachusetts Department of Elementary and Secondary Education will be implementing in the fall of 2018. We will cover a number of different topics during this presentation. We will start by reviewing key takeaways about the new system, followed by a review of the process that has taken us to this point. We will review the indicators that will be included in the new system, as well as how they will be weighted in the accountability calculations. We will also discuss the two different components of the system that will be used in order to categorize schools and districts. Finally, we will talk about how accountability results will be reported. First, let's talk about a few key highlights of the system. Our new school and district accountability system will consist of new indicators. The inclusion of additional indicators beyond student test scores will paint a more complete picture of school performance and student outcomes. There will be two components in the accountability system. The first is a normative component, or accountability percentile. This percentile will provide information about how a school is doing compared to other schools in the state. The second component is criterion-referenced and will provide information about how a school is doing in meeting targets. The new accountability system will place additional emphasis on improving the performance of each school's lowest performing students, in addition to the performance of the school as a whole. Finally, accountability results will no longer be reported using accountability and assistance levels 1 through 5. Instead, each school and district will be classified using accountability categories, not levels. These categories will more clearly identify how the school or district is performing overall and what type of support they may receive from the Department of Elementary and Secondary Education. Before we review the new system, it is important to understand the steps that were taken to get us to this point. The need to redesign our district and school accountability system began in December of 2015 when the Every Student Succeeds Act, or ESSA, was enacted. Among other things, ESSA requires states to include certain measures in their accountability systems that Massachusetts' existing system did not include. The Massachusetts Department of Elementary and Secondary Education began a long period of stakeholder engagement in April of 2016, asking school and district leaders and other stakeholders about what they would like to see in a redesigned accountability system. After about a year of listening to feedback, the department submitted Massachusetts' ESSA state plan to the U.S. Department of Education for approval. In September of 2017, the plan was approved. Since then, we have been modeling the accountability system using the most recent data available and refining the business rules that are required in order to calculate accountability results. Included in this process was the need to update the state's accountability regulations. These regulations were very specific and outlined the measures that were used to place schools and districts into accountability and assistance levels 1 through 5. Since our plan was to discontinue the use of accountability levels, we needed to amend the regulations in order to align them to our approved ESSA state plan. Proposed amendments were shared with the Board of Elementary and Secondary Education in the spring of 2018, and after a period of public comment, were approved by the board in June 2018. The department intends to publish accountability results for all Massachusetts public schools and districts using this new system in the fall of 2018. At their June 26, 2018 meeting, the Board of Elementary and Secondary Education approved the proposed amendments to the state accountability regulations and the framework for district and school accountability described in this presentation. Now, let's talk about the indicators that will be included in the accountability system. The Every Student Succeeds Act requires states to include certain indicators in their accountability systems. These indicators include, but are not limited to, achievement in English language arts, mathematics, and science, student growth, high school graduation rates, progress in achieving English proficiency for English learners, and at least one additional measure of school quality or student success. When we talk about accountability measures for schools in 2018, we have to make a distinction between non-high schools and high schools for a few reasons. The first reason is that non-high schools will have fewer accountability indicators than high schools because non-high schools do not graduate students. Additionally, non-high schools administer the next generation MCAS assessments in ELA and math, while high schools continue to administer the legacy MCAS. For non-high schools, achievement indicators include the next generation MCAS English Language Arts and Mathematics Average Scale Score, and the Science MCAS Composite Performance Index, or CPI. We are able to use the average scaled score for the next generation MCAS results because the new test is designed in such a way that allows us to compare scaled score results across grades. The legacy tests, including science, were built at different times and measure different standards, so we must continue to use the CPI to report science achievement. Student growth in ELA and math will be included, with one change from previous years. The department will now report mean or average student growth percentiles instead of median SGPs. The mean SGP better reflects the results of all students in the school or group, unlike the median, which is less likely to be influenced by the results of a few very high or very low growing students. The final two indicators are new to the accountability system. First, schools that have at least 20 English learners will have a measure of progress made by English learners towards achieving English proficiency. This will be measured by calculating the percentage of students who meet annual targets that get them to English proficiency in 6 years. We will discuss this in more detail later in the presentation. The final indicator for non-high schools is chronic absenteeism. Chronic absenteeism is defined as the percentage of students missing 10% or more of their days in membership. In a typical 180-day school year, this would be the percentage of students who miss 18 or more days. The chronic absenteeism rate includes both excused and unexcused absences and will be calculated for students in grades 1 through 12. High school accountability determinations include the same indicators as we will use for non-high schools, plus a few more. The same indicators that we use for typical 9 to 12 high schools will also be used for middle high schools, for example, schools serving grades 7 through 12 or 8 through 12, as well as for K to 12 schools and K to 12 districts. For the achievement indicators, we will continue to use the Composite Performance Index, or CPI, in English Language Arts, Math, and Science. The mean student growth percentile in ELA and Math will also be included. Although student growth is not a federally required accountability indicator at the high school level, it is a measure of student performance that the department values, and therefore we will continue to include it in high school accountability determinations. There are 3 different measures of high school completion that are also included. They are the 4-year cohort graduation rate, the extended engagement rate, and the annual dropout rate. ESSA requires that states use the 4-year cohort graduation rate. We will also continue to use the annual dropout rate. The extended engagement rate is a new measure, which is the total of the 5-year cohort graduation rate plus the percentage of students from the cohort that remain enrolled in the school after 5 years. This measure replaces the use of the 5-year cohort graduation rate that was used in previous accountability systems, and it incentivizes schools to re-engage or continue to educate students who may need longer than 4 or 5 years to graduate. The English language proficiency measure is the same for high schools as it is for non-high schools. Accountability results for schools with a measurable English learner population, 20 or more students, will include the percentage of students making progress towards achieving English proficiency. There are two additional indicators for high schools. The first is chronic absenteeism, which is the same measure that will be used for non-high schools. The second is a measure of advanced coursework completion. Specifically, the department will calculate the percentage of 11th and 12th graders who complete at least one advanced course. These courses include advanced placement, international baccalaureate, dual enrollment for credit, and other selected rigorous courses. The inclusion of this indicator is intended to provide more information about student opportunity and exposure to challenging courses. The courses will be identified by the department using information from the student course schedule data collection, and students taking any one of these types of courses will count toward the rate for the school or district. The English Proficiency Indicator is a new accountability measure in 2018. As required by ESSA, this indicator will be used in accountability determinations for districts and schools that have at least 20 students who are English learners. For each English learner, targets will be set that place them on a path to achieving English proficiency in 6 years. The targets will be set by taking into consideration each student's initial Access for ELL's assessment results, their enrolled grade, and the number of years they have been enrolled in Massachusetts public schools. School and district performance on this indicator will be measured by calculating the percentage of English learners who meet their targets each year. This is not a measure of students who attain proficiency, but rather a measure of their growth towards proficiency. There are a few important things to remember about the accountability indicators. First, the department intends to use average scaled scores as the measure of achievement for all grades once the assessments have transitioned to the next generation MCAS tests. That includes science in grades 5, 8, and 10, as well as the grade 10 ELA and math tests. Second, accurate and timely data reporting by districts is critical. A school or district's accountability results may be negatively impacted by late or inaccurate data submissions, including but not limited to Student Information Management System or SIMS data and student course schedule data. Now let's review how the indicators we just discussed will be weighted in the accountability system. Federal law provides limited guidance on how indicators should be weighted in the accountability system. ESSA says that substantial weight should be given to the achievement, growth, English language proficiency, and graduation rate indicators, and that when taken together, these indicators should have much greater weight than the additional indicators of school quality or student success. ESSA does not, however, dictate exact weightings. Much of the discussion around the weighting of indicators focuses on the weighting of achievement versus growth. In the most recent accountability system, the ratio of achievement to growth was 3:1, 75% achievement and 25% growth. There are a few pros and cons to keep in mind when thinking about changing or increasing the weight of growth in the system. First, an increased weight of growth may better differentiate between schools with similar achievement. For example, if two schools have the same ELA average scaled score, you could look at the school's ELA SGPs to see if one is demonstrating more success in improving student performance. Second, the student growth percentile is a normative measure, and by increasing the weight of the SGP, you place more value on a normative measure. The SGP is a percentile. It is calculated by taking a group of students who have similar test score histories and assigning each individual a percentile from 1 to 99 based on how they do on the next year's tests. If everyone does well, someone will still be given an SGP of 1. If everyone does poorly, someone will still be given an SGP of 99. While the SGP is a valuable accountability measure, it is important to understand what exactly it represents. Third, if giving more weight to growth, certain assessments will have their value decreased. Growth cannot be calculated for students in grade 3 because they need at least 2 years of assessment results in order to receive an SGP. Additionally, because the science assessments are not administered in every grade, science growth cannot be calculated. Therefore, an increased weight on growth would decrease the value of the grade 3 ELA and math assessments, as well as the science assessments in grades 5, 8, and 10. There are a few things to keep in mind when thinking about the weighting of achievement and growth. First, all indicators need to be included in the weighting. Additionally, the weighting needs to be flexible so that it can vary slightly between schools that have data for the English proficiency indicator and those that do not. So we can no longer think about the weighting in terms of percentages. For example, achievement being worth 75% and growth being worth 25%. The new indicators in the system require a percentage of the pie. However, we can think about the weighting in terms of ratios. The most recent weighting, 75% achievement to 25% growth, is the same as saying that the ratio of achievement to growth is 3 to 1. We can keep the ratio of achievement to growth consistent, but allow for flexibility in the actual percentages where necessary. Finally, the department intends to apply the same weighting rules to both the normative and criterion-referenced components of the accountability system. This was not our practice in the most recent accountability system, but it is something the department feels is important to do moving forward. We will review this in more detail later in the presentation. For 2018 accountability reporting, the department will use a ratio of achievement to growth of 3 to 1. On this slide, you can see the proposed weighting of the accountability indicators for non-high schools. Again, non-high schools are those schools that administer the next generation MCAS tests. You'll notice that there are 2 weighting columns, one for schools with data for the English language proficiency indicator and one for schools without data for that indicator. In schools without results for the English language proficiency indicator, the weight for that indicator has been distributed proportionally across the achievement and growth buckets. You can see that while the actual percentages vary across achievement and growth, the ratio remains consistent at 3 to 1 in both columns. The weighting of chronic absenteeism also remains consistent in both scenarios. Note that the weighting is applied to the indicator, for example, achievement or growth, and that each measure within the indicator bucket has an equal share of the weight. For example, if achievement were weighted at 60%, then ELA, math, and science would each be worth 20%. In a school that does not administer the science assessment, ELA and math would each be worth 30%. Here you can see the proposed weighting of the accountability indicators for high schools. Again, high schools are those schools that administer the legacy MCAS tests and graduate students. The same weighting rules would also be applied to middle high or K-12 schools and K-12 districts. As on the previous slide, there are 2 weighting columns, one for schools with data for the English language proficiency indicator and one for schools without data for that indicator. In schools without results for the English language proficiency indicator, the weight for that indicator has been distributed proportionally across the achievement and growth buckets. At the high school level, the high school completion indicator bucket is considered part of achievement when thinking about the ratio of achievement to growth. So here you can see that when the achievement and high school completion indicators are combined and balanced with growth, they keep the same 3-to-1 ratio. Like with non-high schools, the weighting is applied to the indicator, and each measure within the indicator bucket has an equal share of the weight. As an example, the additional indicators bucket is worth 10%, meaning that chronic absenteeism and advanced coursework completion are each worth 5%. An important takeaway from these last two slides is that the actual percentages will vary based on the available indicators for each school. However, the ratio of achievement to growth can remain consistent. Now that we've covered the indicators and their weights, let's talk about how they will be used in the normative component of the accountability system. Both federal and state laws provide a rationale for using a normative measure of school performance in the accountability system. Federal law requires that states identify the lowest performing 5% of schools as in need of comprehensive support and intervention. It also requires states to identify schools with the lowest performing subgroups statewide. State law requires that in order for the department to identify a school as underperforming, the school must be among the lowest performing 20% of schools statewide. Both laws present an argument for using some sort of normative or comparative measure. The normative component is a percentile from 1 to 99 that is calculated using all available indicators for a school. Schools are grouped together based on the statewide assessments that they administer, and their performance on each indicator is ranked and weighted according to the weighting rules we just reviewed. The resulting number, or the overall accountability percentile, tells you how a school is doing compared to other schools. The department can use this information to identify the lowest performing schools in the state, which is important for the purposes of providing support and allocating resources. The same calculation can be applied at the subgroup level to identify the lowest performing subgroups in the state. For example, the results for all of the white student subgroups can be compared to see which schools have the lowest performing white subgroups in the Commonwealth. This allows us to identify schools where the performance of the school as a whole may be masking the performance of one or more low-performing subgroups. When we compare schools for the purposes of calculating the accountability percentile, they must be grouped according to the tests that they administer, because we are still transitioning to the next generation MCAS tests in some grades. The next generation tests were designed in such a way that allow us to compare grade 8 results to grade 3 results. However, legacy MCAS results cannot be compared to the next generation MCAS results. As a result, for 2018 reporting, schools will be grouped into one of the following three categories: non-high schools, which are schools that only administer the next generation MCAS tests in grades 3 through 8, high schools, or schools that only administer the legacy MCAS tests in grade 10, and middle high or K-12 schools, which administer the legacy grade 10 tests and the next generation MCAS tests in one or more grades 3 through 8. Once all grades and tests have transitioned to the next generation MCAS, the separate comparison categories will no longer be necessary, and all schools will be able to be compared to each other. It is important to understand that the 2018 accountability percentile should not be compared to the school percentile results from previous years to discuss trends, improvement, or declines. First, the 2018 percentile is calculated using a different accountability universe. For example, under the previous accountability system, schools were grouped into 5 school type categories: elementary schools, elementary middle schools, middle high schools, and high schools. As we reviewed on the previous slide, we are now only using 3 comparison categories. So, under the old system, a middle school was compared to about 300 other middle schools. Now they will be compared to about 1,200 elementary elementary, middle, and middle schools combined. Second, the accountability percentile now includes new indicators. Measures like English language proficiency, advanced coursework, and chronic absenteeism were not included in the school percentiles that were calculated from 2012 to 2017. Finally, the 2018 accountability percentile will be based on only 1 year of data. That is, the results from the 2017-18 school year. The Board of Elementary and Secondary Education voted in November of 2015 that the results from the 2017 administration of the Next Generation MCAS tests could not be used to negatively impact school accountability results. When used normatively, results from schools that did not do well on the test in 2017 would negatively impact accountability results. So, the department can only use 2018 data in the first year of reporting. Older percentiles used 4 years of data, and we hope to build up to using multiple years of data in the new accountability percentiles, but that will take time. These 3 factors are very important. While a school's accountability percentile will still be a number 1 to 99, just like they may have received in the past, it does not reflect all of the same information and comparisons. As a result, the 2018 accountability percentiles should not be compared to historical percentiles. Now we will review the second component of the accountability system, the criterion-referenced component. The criterion-referenced component is a measure of each school or district's progress towards targets set for them by the department. Federal law requires states to use long-term goals and interim targets in their accountability systems. Additionally, having a criterion-referenced part of the accountability system allows a school to demonstrate improvement relative to its own targets, not just measure its performance relative to other schools in the state. Finally, it provides additional information about school performance beyond what an accountability percentile might imply. When thinking about setting targets for schools, often it is with the intention of closing gaps. The new accountability system will still focus on gap closing, but instead of closing gaps between groups or between current performance and some higher goal, we are looking to close the achievement gap by raising the achievement floor. Measuring gap closing can be challenging for a couple of reasons. As one example, there need to be 2 distinct groups to compare. In order to measure gap closing between high needs and non-high needs students, you must have both groups. However, in some schools, there are no high needs students. In other schools, there are no non-high needs students. In another example, we have seen gap closing occur when the performance of the higher performing group declines. In thinking about how to focus on closing gaps, we thought about our overall goal: to raise the performance of the lowest performing students. If this is done successfully, then we will also see achievement gaps closing. So in the new system, we intend to measure how schools are doing in meeting targets for the school as a whole, as well as for the lowest performing students in each school. Every school has a group of lowest performing students, even if this group varies in performance from school to school. Additionally, and in direct response to feedback we heard from districts across the state, we intend to include in the lowest performing students group only those students who have been enrolled in the school for more than 1 year. This means that for the first time, Massachusetts will be controlling for student transiency in the district and school accountability system. There are 2 ways to identify the lowest performing students group in a school. The first is the cohort model. In the cohort model, students will be eligible for inclusion in the lowest performing students group if they have been enrolled in the school for 2 consecutive years according to SIMS data, and if they were tested in the same school in the current and prior year. Students who take the MCAS Alt will not be eligible for inclusion in the group, nor will first or second year English learners. The cohort model requires at least 2 years of assessment results. English learners take MCAS in their first year for diagnostic purposes only, so they would not have 2 years of usable MCAS results until their third year. In the cohort model, for 2018 reporting, the department will look at a school's October 2017 SIMS data. Of the students that are currently enrolled this school year, we will identify those students who were enrolled in the same school as of October 2016 and who tested in that school in spring 2017. The ELA and math achievement results for each of these students will be averaged, and the lowest performing students will be identified. In fall 2018, the department will compare the performance of these students in 2017 to the results from the spring 2018 tests, and improvement will be reported accordingly. If a school is very small and a cohort cannot be identified, then the school's accountability results will be based on the performance of all students in the school. The cohort approach will not work for all schools, including high schools and schools that end in grade 3. So in instances where it will not work, the department will use a year-to-year approach. In the year-to-year approach, students will be eligible for inclusion in the lowest performing students group if they have been enrolled in the school for 2 consecutive years according to SIMS data, and if they were tested in the same school in the current year. Students who take the MCAS Alt will not be eligible for inclusion in the group, nor will first or second year English learners. In the year-to-year approach, for 2018 reporting, the department will look at the performance of a school's lowest performing students in 2018 and compare it to the performance of the lowest performing students in the previous year. While this does mean comparing the results of 2 different groups of students, we are still controlling for transiency by including only those students who were enrolled in the school for 2 years. If a school is very small and a cohort cannot be identified, then the school's accountability results will be based on the performance of all students in the school. A student will be identified as eligible for inclusion in the lowest performing students group if the average of their ELA and math MCAS scaled scores combined is among the lowest average scaled scores in the school. Each school and district can likely figure out who their lowest performing students are, but the department will also provide a list each year. For 2018 reporting, lists will be posted to secure drop boxes later in the spring, along with explanatory materials. For future reporting, lists will be available in the fall. For each school and district as a whole, targets will be set for each of the achievement, growth, high school completion, EL progress, and additional indicators. For non-high schools, targets will not be set for the graduation, dropout, and extended engagement rate indicators, as these do not apply to non-high schools. For each school and district's lowest performing students group, targets will also be set for achievement, growth, and chronic absenteeism indicators. High school completion, advanced coursework, and EL progress targets will not be set for this group. If any school or group does not have results for at least 20 students for a specific indicator, targets will not be set. In 2018, targets will be set only for 1 year, using 2017 data as the baseline. The department can use 2017 next generation results for the purposes of setting targets because if a school did poorly on the 2017 tests, it will benefit them by establishing a lower baseline for the purposes of target setting. Even though we only have 1 year of next generation MCAS data, the department can set conservative yet reasonable achievement targets for 2018. We can do so using a statistical approach that allows us to look at schools that have demonstrated improvement on the legacy MCAS tests. In doing so, we can see what the average improvement looked like across improvers only, not statewide, where results have been relatively flat, and apply the same expectation of improvement to the new test scale. Long-term targets will be set in the future once we have multiple years of next-generation MCAS data to analyze. Targets for the legacy MCAS tests and non-assessment indicators will be set by analyzing past trends using data that the department has been collecting and reporting for several years. Based on each school's target and actual performance, the department will assign points for each indicator. This will be done for the school as a whole and for the lowest performing students group. Points will be assigned on a 0 to 4 scale, with 0 representing a decline in performance, 1 representing no change, 2 representing improvement below the target, 3 representing meeting the target, and 4 representing exceeding the target. The goal is to earn at least a 3 for each indicator to be considered to be meeting targets overall. However, the system is designed to be compensatory, so that if a school earns a combination of 2s and 4s or another combination of points, they may still potentially be considered to be meeting targets in the overall calculation. This slide shows how the criterion-referenced calculation will be done for a non-high school. For the school as a whole, the actual points earned and the total possible points will be reported for each indicator. Achievement, growth, EL progress, and chronic absenteeism points will be weighted according to the percentages we reviewed earlier in the presentation and calculated into a percentage of possible points for the all students group. The same will be done for the achievement, growth, and chronic absenteeism indicators for the lowest performing students group. The two percentage of possible points values will then be averaged, resulting in the school's overall criterion-referenced target percentage. The goal is to earn 75% or higher, which would be an average of earning all 3s, which represents meeting targets. You will note that when averaging the percentage of possible points for the all students and lowest performing students groups, that this was done equally. That means that the results for the lowest performing students in the school account for half of the school's overall calculation of performance against target. At the high school level, the process is the same, but with additional indicators and slightly different indicator weightings. Again, the goal is to earn 3 points for each indicator for the all students group and the lowest performing students group, which would result in an overall criterion reference target percentage of 75%, indicating that the school is meeting targets. Middle high schools, K-12 schools, and K-12 districts will use the same calculation as high schools. Up to this point, we have covered which indicators will be used in the accountability system and how they will be weighted in the calculations. We have discussed the 2 different components that will go into the accountability determination, the normative component, which is the accountability percentile, and the criterion-referenced component, which is the overall percentage of targets met. Now we will review how these 2 components will be used in order to categorize schools. In the new accountability system, schools will no longer be placed into accountability and assistance levels 1 through 5. As we talk about accountability determinations for schools and districts moving forward, we will refer to the determinations as categories, not levels. The number of schools that will be placed into an accountability category based on their percentile will be cut in half. Under the old system, the lowest performing 20% of schools were automatically placed into level 3. In the new system, only the lowest performing 10% of schools will be placed into a category based on their accountability percentile. This change is in direct response to feedback we heard from stakeholders about the old system. People felt like the percentile was a valuable measure of school performance, but that 20% of schools was a very large number of schools to receive an automatic designation. As a result, We will now use the percentile to categorize the lowest performing 10% of schools. The remaining 90% of schools will be placed into an accountability category based on the criterion-referenced component of the system, that is, how they performed against their own targets. As you may remember, 50% of this calculation is based on the results of students who have been enrolled in the school for more than 1 year, the lowest performing students group. Another criticism of the old accountability system was that levels 1 through 5 were vague and subject to interpretation. So instead of using levels or some other labeling process, the accountability categories will consist of more factual statements about school performance and will more clearly describe whether the school is in need of assistance or intervention from the department. Finally, the department intends to continue its practice of commending schools for success and will place a stronger emphasis on the schools that are recognized. The chart on this slide shows how schools will be placed into categories. We will start with the right side of the chart. Schools in the rightmost two categories will be those schools that require assistance or intervention. Within this category, there will be two levels of support. The first is that of broad or comprehensive support. These are schools that are identified as either underperforming or chronically underperforming in accordance with state law. This designation is made at the discretion of the Commissioner of Elementary and Secondary Education. It is not the automatic result of a mathematical exercise. The other designation is that of needing focused or targeted support. If a school has not been designated as needing broad or comprehensive support, then there are a few ways that the school could be given this designation. The first is using the normative component of the system. If the school has an accountability percentile from 1 to 10, meaning it is among the lowest performing 10% of schools, then the school will be designated as needing focused or targeted support. Second, any school with a low graduation rate, that is, a school that graduates less than 66.7% of its students, will be identified as needing focused or targeted support. This graduation requirement is written into ESSA, and therefore states must include it in the system. Third, any school with a low-performing subgroup may be placed in this category. A low-performing subgroup is identified using the accountability percentile calculation at the subgroup level in order to identify the lowest performing 10% of subgroups in the state. This, also required by ESSA, allows the department to identify places where the overall school results may be masking the performance of one or more low-performing subgroups. Finally, schools will be placed into this category if they have low assessment participation for one or more subgroups. Maintaining high levels of assessment participation is also a requirement of both state and federal laws. Because of the additional schools identified as needing focused or targeted support for reasons like low graduation rate, low participation, or subgroup performance, we anticipate that approximately 15% of schools will be categorized as requiring assistance or intervention. The other 85% of schools will be identified as not requiring assistance or intervention. Instead, these schools will receive a designation based on how they did against their targets using the criterion-referenced component of the system that we discussed earlier. In 2018, schools will be reported as either meeting targets or partially meeting targets based on their criterion-referenced target percentage. Beginning in 2019, schools will be reported as meeting targets, partially meeting targets, or not meeting targets. Finally, some schools will be recognized for demonstrating high achievement, high growth, or for other reasons. All schools will have their accountability percentile and performance against targets reported. They will be used to determine the school's level of need for assistance or intervention by reviewing the criteria from right to left as displayed on this slide. One final note. The category names have not yet been finalized. We expect to finalize them in the coming months. When the department issues accountability determinations this fall, please keep in mind a few important things. First, current Level 4 schools will be assigned a designation of underperforming, and current Level 5 schools will be designated as chronically underperforming until an exit decision is made by the commissioner. This is the language used in state statute, and just like the commissioner has the authority to designate a school as underperforming or chronically underperforming, he also determines when a school may exit that status. Second, schools that end in grade 3 will be classified based on the criterion-referenced component only. In order to calculate an accountability percentile, a school must have student growth results. Since students do not receive a growth percentile until grade 4, the performance of these schools will be based solely on their performance against targets. Third, any school that does not serve tested grades, for example, schools ending in grades kindergarten 1 or 2, will be classified as having insufficient data. Finally, any school with low assessment participation will be designated as needing focused or targeted support. State law requires all students to participate in MCAS testing, and federal law requires at least 95% participation. This calculation will be done for the school as a whole, as well as for each subgroup for each subject area test. If a school has less than 95% participation for any group in any subject, we will look at their 2-year assessment participation rate and use the higher of the two rates in the school's accountability results. This 2-year look should mitigate the impact of a few non-participants in small subgroups. Let's practice categorizing non-high schools. In non-high school number 1, the school has an accountability percentile of 16, has a criterion-referenced target percentage of 51%, has participation rates all above 95%, and does not have any low-performing subgroups. As a result, this school would be classified as partially meeting targets. It is not among the lowest 10% of schools, and it does not have any subgroup performance or participation issues, so its performance against targets drives its designation. In non-high school number 2, the school has an accountability percentile of 31, has criterion-referenced target percentage of 66%, has participation rates all above 95%, and has one low-performing subgroup. As a result, this school would be classified as needing focused or targeted support. While it is not among the lowest 10% of schools, it does have a low-performing subgroup, again, determined by using the percentile calculation at the subgroup level to find schools with subgroups that are among the lowest performing 10% of groups statewide. Now, let's practice categorizing high schools. In high school number 1, the school has an accountability percentile of 42, has a criterion-referenced target percentage of 75%, has participation rates all above 95%, and does not have any low-performing subgroups. Because this is a high school, we must also look at the school's graduation rate, which for this school is 66%. As a result, this school would be classified as needing focused or targeted support. It is not among the lowest 10% of schools, it is meeting its targets, and it does not have any subgroup performance or participation issues. However, ESSA requires that any school that graduates less than 66.7% of its students to be identified as in need of support. In high school number 2, the school has an accountability percentile of 12, has a criterion-referenced target percentage of 76%, has participation rates above 95%, has no low-performing subgroup, and graduates more than 2/3 of its students. As a result, this school would be classified as meeting targets. While it is close, it is not among the lowest 10% of schools. It does not have any subgroup performance, participation, or graduation rate issues, so its performance against targets drives its designation. Now let's review how districts will be classified. Beginning in 2018, districts will no longer be classified based on the performance of their lowest performing school. Instead, the district will be treated like one big school and will be classified based on its overall performance. The department will not calculate district percentiles for the purposes of accountability reporting. Instead, districts will be classified based on how they do against district-level targets using just the criterion-referenced component of the system. Some adjustments will be made for districts with low assessment participation rates or low graduation rates at the district level, as you'll see in a moment. Additionally, the Board of Elementary and Secondary Education has the authority to designate a district as underperforming or chronically underperforming based on overall district performance. This chart depicts how districts will be classified. Like with schools, a small number of districts will be identified as requiring assistance or intervention. These districts will either be identified as needing broad or comprehensive support if designated underperforming or chronically underperforming by the Board of Elementary and Secondary Education, or as needing focused or targeted support if the district as a whole graduates less than 66.7% of its students or assesses less than 95% of its students on the MCAS tests. The rest of the districts will be categorized as not requiring assistance or intervention. These districts will be reported as meeting or partially meeting targets in 2018, or meeting, partially meeting, or not meeting targets in 2019, based on the criterion-referenced target percentage calculation. Finally, let's quickly review how accountability results will be reported. In fall 2018, every school and district in the Commonwealth will receive an accountability report that contains the information covered in this presentation. Each report will include the school or district's overall classification and the reason for the classification, the school or district's criterion-referenced target percentages and performance against targets, and schools will receive an accountability percentile. Additionally, each school and district will receive information on the performance on each of the accountability indicators for the school as a whole, the lowest performing students group, special populations, and each of the major racial and ethnic subgroups that meet the minimum group size of 20 students required for reporting. In addition to detailed accountability reports, the department will also publish updated school and district report cards by the end of the calendar year. These report cards, which are also required by ESSA, will contain accountability and assessment information in addition to other important information. Measures like student discipline, access to the arts, educator qualifications, course passing rates, and per pupil spending will also be included. Report cards are intended to complement accountability and assessment reports to paint a broader picture of school performance and student opportunity. Thank you for reviewing this presentation on Massachusetts' Next Generation District and School Accountability System. If you have questions about the information in this presentation, please feel free to contact our Office of District and School Accountability Reporting by phone at 781-338-3550 or by email at esea@doe.mass.edu.